We're in the market for some new Apple laptops because aside from this channel, we run a digital agency and it's time to replace some of the equipment in the business. We need 4 general purpose computers and 3 more powerful machines for creative workflows. And we've been holding off to see whether Apple's new M2 MacBook Air would be able to meet our needs. Perhaps some entry-level Airs for the general purpose machines and then maybe some spec'd up versions for those creative workflows. After all, you can now spec the M2 with a whopping 24 gigs of RAM. The thing is, the way Apple has positioned these models in the lineup doesn't make much sense. And so we've decided to buy M1 MacBook Airs and 14-inch MacBook Pros instead. Now this is a genuine business purchasing decision, not sensationalism. I wanted to share our thought process and findings with you. And if you're in the market for an M2 machine, I might just be able to save you some money. The M2 is a generational improvement on the M1. You get better single-core performance, better multi-core performance, better graphics performance, and better memory performance. It also gains dedicated encoders and decoders for ProRes video, which will please some people. It is objectively a better chip. Apple has perhaps confused consumers and tech reviewers by putting that chip first into the 13-inch MacBook Pro chassis. And well, you can search YouTube for plenty of content on that, and I'm not going to wade into the thermal performance debate here. What I want to focus on is the purchasing decision. And when it comes to buying Apple computers, you need to know that Apple has off-the-shelf specifications and custom order, or CTO models. This is important. Take the M2 models that are on offer. Apple offers 2 default or off-the-shelf specifications for each of these. And these are the models that you can buy if you go to an Apple retail store. And they're also the models which are available from resellers. If you want anything different to these specs, that's a custom order, or CTO, which you can only order from the Apple online store. Now the second thing that you need to know is that there is a difference in the SSD specs for these M2 models. MaxTech and iFixit have opened up the base M2 MacBook Pro and found that it only has 1 NAND chip for the SSD. This appears to apply only to the base 256GB configuration. And so we have one 256GB NAND chip instead of the 2 128GB chips that we had in the M1. And why should that matter? Well, if there are 2 chips, the SSD controller can use them in parallel to speed things up. With just 1 NAND chip, that's no longer possible. So the net effect of this is that compared to the 256GB M1 models, the M2 is 25% slower on writing data and up to 50% slower on reading. Now, let's be clear here. This is still a very fast SSD, and in the real world, you wouldn't actually expect to see much of a performance hit outside of tasks which rely on heavy reading or writing of data. And under any sustained load, SSDs get hot and throttle back their performance anyway. But there is an area where this will be felt, and that's memory swapping. For some reason, despite the fact that it's 2022, Apple insists on speccing these very expensive laptops with just 8GB of RAM, which is not really enough. Remember that you've got 8 CPU cores and up to 10 graphics cores all sharing that RAM. I mean, frankly, it's astonishing what these machines are able to do with so little physical memory. And that's down to Apple's careful optimization of software and hardware. The SSD controller is actually part of the M2 chip. And Apple makes use of clever tricks like memory compression. But these 8GB machines rely quite heavily on swapping memory to the SSD. Basically, the system copies blocks of memory that are not actively being used over to the SSD and copies them back again when they're needed. And this has a minimal impact on day-to-day use because those SSDs are so fast. But if we slow the SSD down, then we've got a potential performance hit once that machine is being fully utilized. And again, this has been demonstrated on the M2 models by other tech outlets, so it does seem to be a real thing. How much it affects you will largely depend on your workflow and how you use your computer. For anyone in the market for a general purpose computer to handle day-to-day office tasks, web browsing, email, watching video, and even some more demanding tasks like photo editing or basic video editing, well then the entry-level MacBook Air will be a fine machine. And for the most part, it will offer a small performance improvement in the real world over M1. But it's true to say there will also be a very small minority of tasks where the M2 may actually perform worse than the M1. So if you're thinking of upgrading from M1 to M2, there's something else you need to remember. and that is that benchmarks possibly paint a bit of a misleading picture. Yes, the M2 does have better single-core performance, but in the real world you may not notice this because the M1 is already very fast. When it comes to multi-core performance, bear in mind that the benchmarking app is designed to max out every single one of those CPU cores, but it's not actually that common for productivity apps to do that in the real world. So whilst you may see a benchmark improvement of 19% over M1, the real-world improvement will probably be less in most cases. Graphics, though, is an area where you will see improvements, especially if you do a bit of light gaming on your Mac. The M2, with its 2 additional GPU cores and the improved memory bandwidth, offers a very decent upgrade over M1, but there's a catch here if you're buying the M2 MacBook Air. The entry-level off-the-shelf specification has a binned version of the M2, which has 8 GPU cores instead of 10. Now sure, you can spec the better version of the chip for an extra £100 or $100, but then you have a custom order or CTO model. If you want the 10 graphics cores in an off-the-shelf model, you've got to go for that more expensive spec, which also gives you a 512GB SSD. And that's probably a good thing, but that model is £300 or $300 more expensive than the base model. It's not a cheap laptop. If you don't need that additional graphics performance in your MacBook Air, then there's another problem. Apple is still selling the M1 MacBook Air, which is already a brilliant general purpose computer. And remember how we said that off-the-shelf models are also sold by resellers? Well, the M1 models are old enough now that resellers are discounting them. Prices vary, but I've seen the base model as cheap as £849 on Amazon UK. And you can also get the model with 512 gigs of storage for quite a bit less than the price of the entry-level M2 MacBook Air. Of course, with the M2 you are getting that newer case design. You get MagSafe and you get a slightly brighter display. But if you're not bothered about those things, the M1 MacBook Air is still the best value consumer ultrabook on the market, in my opinion. So for us, the general purpose machines that we need for staff that work in project management, sales, administration, those sort of things, the M1 MacBook Air is what we're going to continue to buy. But what about those creative workflows? Does the M2 start to make sense here? Well, we'll need to spec those machines with at least 512 gigabytes on the SSD, and we'll want at least 16 gigs of RAM. That's the minimum spec that I would consider acceptable for a machine that we expect to give our business at least 3 years of service before we upgrade it. And that means that we have to have a CTO model that we have to order online, and it's going to cost us £1,749 or $1,699. And incidentally, if you're wondering why we pay more in the UK than in the United States, it's mainly because our pricing includes the 20% sales tax we pay, whereas in the USA, prices are shown before state sales tax. The problem here is that we're now getting very close to the price of the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip. The base off-the-shelf configuration for that has got the same 16 gigs of RAM and 512 storage, and it's priced at £1,899 or $1,999. The M1 Pro that features in this entry spec is a binned chip, so it has 8 CPU cores instead of 10 and 14 graphics cores instead of 16. Of those 8 CPU cores, 6 are performance cores compared to the M2's 4. So as a result, this chip offers around 14% better multi-core performance than the M2 in benchmarks. Of course, the M2 has better single-core performance, roughly 9% better, but that's not a primary consideration in a machine that will be focused on heavier workloads. The M1 Pro also has double the memory bandwidth of the M2. So with that and those additional GPU cores, even this bin chip offers around 20% better graphics performance than the 10 GPU core M2. So is that performance uplift worth £150 or $300? I think it probably is, but that's not all you're getting for your extra money. The 14-inch MacBook Pro is a slightly larger, slightly thicker and heavier chassis, but it has more ports. There are 3 Thunderbolt ports, and these are proper Thunderbolt 4 specification rather than USB 4 with Thunderbolt 3 like you get with the M2. And that means you can drive more than one external display with the 14-inch. And you'll likely get better performance if you use a lot of things like external storage drives. There's also an HDMI port and a card reader. But perhaps one of the most significant benefits is the mini LED XDR display. It's the same brightness as the M2 MacBook Air in normal use, but if you work with HDR content, it can go much brighter. And being mini LED means blacks are properly black, and contrast is better. And it's a ProMotion display supporting refresh rates up to 120 Hz. Add all of those benefits to the performance improvements, and it leaves you wondering what the point is in buying an upgraded M2 MacBook Air. True, £150 or $300 is not an inconsequential amount of money, but the value that you get for that additional spend is surely worth saving a bit longer or maybe having a slightly higher monthly payment. Now, naturally, there are pros and cons to each choice, and there may be something specific to you and your workflow that makes one or other of these machines a better fit. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You do need to buy the machine that's right for you. But remember that the M1 Pro machine that we're talking about is an off-the-shelf specification, and it's been out for long enough that resellers are discounting it. And I've seen it advertised at £1,735 on Amazon UK and $1,799 at various outlets stateside. And that makes it cheaper than any M2 model with the same RAM and storage. So for us, that makes it an absolute no-brainer. We'll buy the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip. The M2 may well be a fantastic generational improvement, but the fact that Apple still sells the M1 MacBook Air and the fact that they chose that higher price point for the M2 machines means that for us, and probably most users, the M2 doesn't seem to make good financial sense. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments section. And we've popped links in the description for those better priced machines on Amazon. As always, we're really grateful for your support when you like or dislike this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. See you again soon for some more geekery.